Hello, can people hear me? Thank you very much. Thank you. I ngā iwi, I ngā mana, I ngā hoa mahi. Tēnā koutou katoa. E mihi ana ki a koutou, kua tai mai ki te tautoko tēnei kaupapa. Kei te mihi aho ki a Philip Stevens, koro ko Matthew Galt. Kona kai kōrero o te rā, tēnā korua. Ko Karen Fowley toku ingoa, no mai haere mai, ki te tai ohanga. So thank you everyone for coming today. It's fabulous to see so many people in the room and to be back in this world. We can actually have in-person seminars as well as ones online. As I said, I'm Karen Fowley, here Manutaki Economic Strategy Director at AHO. So I'm the Director of the Economic Strategy Directorate at the Treasury. If I can just start with a few quick health and safety briefings for all of those in the room. Those online, please bear with us. In the event of a fire alarm, please follow Treasury staff to the nearest exit, which I think you'll find is down that way, and progress down the stairwell to evacuate the building. Don't use the lifts. In the event of an earthquake, you know what to do, drop, cover, hold. Stay in the building until instructed by a warden. Bathrooms can be found to the left-hand side of the kitchenette. Walk straight out after exiting the rooms. So as I said, welcome everybody. It's fabulous to have you all here and online to hear from today's speakers from Treasury's Guest Lecture Seminar Series. It's a really special event today because it is jointly hosted with the New well, many of our speakers in the seminar series to date have brought in the international context. We thought it was really, really important to hear from those that have the perspective of how these trends are playing out in the New Zealand context as well. So today we have two great speakers with us to reflect on New Zealand's productivity and income performance. They will be fantastic. So Matthew Galt has come from the New Zealand Association of Economists presentation last week to talk to us today about his work that he's recently produced for the Treasury. Matt's a senior analyst in the macro and fiscal policy team. He started his career at the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, analysing the New Zealand and international economies and also the banking sector, and he's worked on housing, monetary and fiscal policy issues. And Philip Stevens, who I'm sure will need no introduction to many of you, is Productivity Commission's Director of Economics and Research. He was also a General Manager of Analysis, Research and Evaluation at the Ministry of Education and also at MB. Philip has published in leading peer-reviewed international journals on subjects such as productivity analysis, employment, competition, evaluation, the measurement of performance in the public sector, broadband, R&D and human capital, and he has a doctorate in economics from the University of Oxford. We'll also be joined for the Q&A session at the end by Tim, who brings in an additional perspective. So Tim is currently the Strategic Economic Advisor here at the Treasury, having held a number of previous roles here, including the Chief Economist role. Prior to the Treasury, Tim worked for the Reserve Bank, the Bank for International Settlements, and also the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. So today our presenters will be providing an overview of trends in productivity and incomes in Aotearoa over recent decades. Their respective presentations will help us to better understand the challenges hindering our productivity and opportunity, and also the opportunities to enhance productivity performance in New Zealand. To provide you with an overview of today's session, Matt and Philip will each present for about 20 minutes, and I will be keeping them to 20 minutes. Philip has already informed me in advance that he's likely to go over, but we will try to keep our speakers to 20 minutes. And then we will have the remainder of the time for questions. And we will allow questions from the room as well as from the online audience. For those online, we'll be using the Q&A function in Teams, so please post your questions there. And if you have any technical queries, please use the standard chat function. Right, our first speaker is Matt Galt, who will speak to the recent trends in productivity and income in New Zealand and why the two have diverged and what that might mean for our future incomes. Thank you, Matt. Kia ora.
Thanks very much for that. Welcome, Karen. I see the sound seems to be going all right on mine now, but do let me know and I can pause if we have any sound issues again. First thing first, a quick disclaimer. The findings in this presentation are strictly those of me, the presenter, not official government policy or the views of the Treasury. This talk mainly draws on an analytical note, which I published a couple of weeks ago on examining New Zealand's average rate of income growth from the late 90s to 2019. Yes, the Treasury puts this out to support public debate. So on to the content. I thought it would be worth just starting out with a couple of minutes on New Zealand's distinctive economic context. So this will be familiar to a number of you who follow the New Zealand economy closely, but a lot of research on income growth and productivity comes out of North America and Europe, and there's so much we can learn from that, but it's also worth remembering how New Zealand's different as well before diving into the details of New Zealand's productivity performance. So first and most obviously, New Zealand is a small country a long way from the major hubs of global economic activity in North America, Europe and East Asia. And this means that some aspects of economic performance will always be more challenging for us, such as scaling up international trade. But what we do have is abundant natural and agricultural resources, and that flows through to our industry mix shown in that chart on the right. So we have a much larger agricultural and forestry sector than the OECD average, and we have a correspondingly smaller manufacturing sector. The largest component of our economy, though, is actually services. So that's things like health, education, logistics, property, IT, and so on. So when we think about productivity performance, it will be important to think about the economy as a whole. And when we talk about lifting productivity, we're talking about getting more outputs for less inputs. So using technology so that we have to do less toil to get more of the things people value. We also have a slightly larger construction sector than the OECD average. So just a couple more things of context on New Zealand. We do have pretty good skills in our population. So this chart on the left is from the Productivity Commission's publication Productivity by the Numbers. And it shows that around 40% of the New Zealand working age population has a tertiary qualification, with most of those being bachelor's qualifications or equivalent. And that's near the OECD average. Perhaps a shade below some of the other countries we like to compare ourselves to, but a pretty solid skill base. And that's key to productivity, which Philip will talk more to later. The other thing that makes New Zealand quite distinct is our very highly regarded governments, institutions, and so on. So that's the chart on the right. That shows a World Bank metric of New Zealand's percentile ranking on a range of measures of governance, like rule of law, quality of regulation, effectiveness of government. And New Zealand's there at the 97th percentile of all countries that they look at, about 200 countries. So that's not only towards the top of the OECD, shown in that chart there, but also towards the very top of the world. So next I want to talk mainly to the content of the analytical note I published a couple of weeks ago. And this looks at New Zealand's income growth over the last few decades. So the short story from this is that New Zealand's economic performance was pretty poor from the 1970s to the 1990s. But since the late 1990s, our average per capita incomes have actually caught up a fair bit to other OECD countries, but not all the way. We're still below in levels terms, and we've got a particularly long way to go on key traditional metrics of productivity, hourly productivity. So to start off, that chart on the left shows one of those traditional measures of hourly productivity. That chart shows New Zealand's GDP per hour worked as a percentage of each of those other countries. So the yellow line shows New Zealand's real GDP per hour worked as a percentage of Australia. The black line in New Zealand is a percent of the G7 average, simple average of the G7 countries. And the purple line, New Zealand is a percentage of the median of 13 small and medium-sized OECD countries, chosen based on data availability. And what you can see there is a familiar, slightly sad story of New Zealand's economic performance. Back in the early 1970s, our real GDP per hour worked, which is labour productivity, was up around most of the other OECD countries we like to compare ourselves to. We then grew at a quite considerably slower rate than other OECD countries, and our real GDP per hour worked slid relative to other countries through the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. And since the 1990s, we've broadly kept up with other countries in growth terms, but we haven't closed the gap in levels terms. So we're still around 2/3 of typical other OECD countries there. There's been some recent research, though, that's pointed out that this metric on the left isn't a complete measure of incomes available to New Zealand residents, though. And for a measure like that, you want a chart more like that on the right. So this shows New Zealand's real net national income per capita as a percent of each of those other countries. What you can see is a similar story through the 70s, 80s, and 1970s and 80s, with New Zealand falling behind. But since the late 1990s, we've actually caught back up a fair bit against a lot of these countries, particularly against some of the larger countries like Italy, Japan, and France, but also to some extent against other small and medium countries in the United States. So the difference between what's measured in the left and right-hand charts is shown in that table below. So the first difference is you start with real GDP per hour worked, and then if you account for the annual hours worked per person, you get real GDP per capita. So that's one adjustment. And there's various pros and cons to aspects to hourly versus per capita metrics. Of course, we always want more hourly output. There's more with less, or that's a good thing. But the income available to New Zealanders on a weekly or annual basis also matters, and that's captured by per capita metrics. Then you can add on terms of trade gains. So that's how export prices have moved relative to import prices. And yeah, so that gets you to real measures of income. So GDP is a measure of domestic production, and it doesn't account for how much that production's worth in global markets. So you account for that. And then the fourth or third adjustment is changing your unit of measurement from domestic, that's things that happen within New Zealand borders, to residents, so that's New Zealand people. And you add on net international investment and labour income. So that's investment or labour income earned by New Zealanders abroad or paid by New Zealanders to foreign nationals. That gets you real gross national income per capita. And then the last adjustment is subtracting depreciation of the built capital stock. So GDP is a gross measure. Some of that production we need to plough back into maintaining our houses, roads, buildings, and so on. So once you account for the depreciation of those, that gives you real net national income per capita. And that's one measure of the income available to New Zealanders to consume and to build our net capital stock. So next I want to dig into what's behind more into what's behind the difference between these two metrics and how New Zealand's caught up, even though its hourly productivity growth on left hasn't been particularly stellar. So this chart here shows the contributions to growth in real net national income per capita starting in the 1995 to 2002 average, so centered on the late 1990s, through to 2019. It shows New Zealand, a few measures of averages for other OECD countries, then Australia and the G7. So, like in the chart before, New Zealand has, in terms of real GDP per hour worked, sort of been in the same ballpark as most other countries. That's the blue bars there. Maybe a shade below, but not massively different. Where we are different is those other sources of income growth. So we're working more hours per capita. We've had favourable terms of trade impacts, which have supported our incomes. Our net international income's improved. That's a narrowing of the deficit we have rather than an increase in a surplus, but we'll come to that later. And the other thing is we've had a broadly flat depreciation burden, whereas most other countries have had increases which have weighed slightly on their income growth. I want to dig into each of those additional sources of income growth for New Zealand in more detail shortly, but just want to mention a couple of other interesting cases on this chart. One's Australia. Clearly, they've had large terms of trade gains from increases in commodity prices there. But to some extent, maybe not as large as you might have expected compared to New Zealand. Partly that's timing. This is 2019 when commodity prices weren't at their peak. But partly it's also that Australia has a smaller traded share of GDP than New Zealand. So a given lift in their terms of trade doesn't have quite as much of an impact on their incomes as it does for New Zealand. Another interesting case is the US. So they've had very solid growth in labour productivity, but falling hours per capita. And that's been a cause of a fair bit of concern in the US with quite slow growth or declines in their labour force participation. And then a third interesting case is Japan, which is almost the opposite of New Zealand. So they've had very solid productivity growth, but falling hours worked per capita, perhaps related to population ageing, and a fall in terms of trade, perhaps related to being in the manufacturing sector disproportionately. Next I'll talk to each of those other sources of growth for New Zealand. So first, skip the slide there. First, hours worked per capita. Now it's a common line in New Zealand is that we're working harder rather than smarter. And that's true to some extent, but I want to suggest there's a bit of nuance to it. And perhaps a range of pros and cons rather than it being exclusively a problematic thing. So that first chart on the left shows a decomposition of the change in hours worked per capita in New Zealand. The blue bar is the contribution from the change in the share of the total population in work, and the orange bar is the contribution from the change in annual hours worked. So most of our growth in hours worked has actually come from more people entering and remaining in work, rather than each individual toiling more hours per year. You can break that down a bit more. So part of that seems to be demographics. New Zealand's population on average has aged slower than other countries, perhaps related to immigration, and that accounts for a few percentage points of it. But a big part of it's actually lifts in employment within demographic cohorts, which is that chart on the right. So most countries, New Zealand, the G7 average, and 13 small and medium countries, they've all seen quite big lifts in participation of women aged 25 to 54 and older people as well. But New Zealand's seen a considerably larger lift in employment, actually, of all those broad categories of demographics. That chart on the left holds demographics across those groups constant, so it looks just at the within the trends within those cohorts. We've also, there'll be labour demand and labour supply effects to this. So some people will need to work to meet their living costs, particularly given the still lower level of incomes in New Zealand. But in some senses, this is a fairly positive trend because it suggests that people who want to work or need to work are able to have that opportunity in New Zealand. And there are some fairly other fairly favourable statistics about New Zealand's job growth over this period. So it's been relatively high skill. About 70% of the net job growth has been managers and professionals. More of New Zealand's job growth has been full-time compared to other countries. We've had some wage growth compared to other countries, which I'll talk to later. And in the last decade, we've also had stronger wage growth at the lower skill end, which suggests some favourable distributional trends going on in the labour market. So overall, this suggests there's a lot of aspects of New Zealand's labour market that are going well, although it doesn't obviously get us more productivity growth per hour. So we need to also bear that in mind. The second source of New Zealand's additional income growth has been the terms of trade. So this is how export prices move relative to import prices. And this chart here shows nominal export price indexes for goods and services together for New Zealand, Australia, and the simple average of the G7. So what you can see here is that New Zealand's import prices have broadly tracked other countries, and what's particularly different is our export prices. So our export prices have lifted. Australia's have lifted, of course, even more with their terms of trade. So this will be no shock to anyone. Rising food prices have favoured New Zealand, and that supported our real incomes beyond what's captured in real GDP, which is a production measure that doesn't account for this. Now, a common idea with the terms of trade is that most of it is really just external. New Zealand has no control over it. And definitely there's a large element of luck to it. It moves around a lot with the movements in global prices. But I want to suggest that, again, there's some nuance here, and that New Zealand does have some influence over its terms of trade over the long term when you look through the ups and downs of global prices. And one way of illustrating this is if you break down our exports and imports into their individual commodities. Imports on the left, exports on the right. And you can break down those indexes I had on the previous slides into the change in price, which is on the x-axis, and the change in the composition of the basket, so the change in volume of imports and exports of each of those things. And what you see on the import side is a very strong correlation between goods that have fallen in price, New Zealand's importing more. So this perhaps reflects the New Zealand economy reorienting to take advantage of movements in global prices, and we've shifted to import more of those particularly manufacturing heavy commodities like capital goods and consumption goods and cars, producing less of them domestically, and that's over time allowed our domestic economy to focus more on our core comparative advantages of agriculture and services. You don't actually see much of a pattern on the export side. So we've had lifts in prices and volumes of some of those things. Dairy prices have gone up and volumes have increased, likewise other food, likewise services like travel. But overall, there isn't a strong correlation there. Meat prices is an interesting one where you've had large increase in meat prices without much response in volumes. A variety of reasons why that might have been the case, like competition for land use. But yeah, overall, less than you might have expected to see over this period. Over a longer time period, there's evidence of the New Zealand export sector adapting, such as exiting wool, entering other products with higher prices, but not over this time period. Now, you can actually use these components to construct a counterfactual of what the terms of trade might have been if the export and import basket hadn't changed over this period. And that's shown on this next chart here. So the black line is what the terms of trade has roughly actually done. The blue line's what it would have done if our export basket had stayed the same as it was in the 1995 to 2002 period. And the orange line is what it would have been if our import basket had stayed the same as it was at the start of the period. And so even though a couple of slides back, New Zealand's import prices had broadly tracked other countries, what this suggests is that if we hadn't had that adaptation on the import side, we would have had those import prices rising and our terms of trade wouldn't have increased as much. So that change in the import basket seems to account for about a third or a bit more of the lift in New Zealand's terms of trade over this period, which has supported our real incomes to a substantial extent. Just on the last couple of components, net international income. So this is mostly investment income in New Zealand's case. During our period of economic underperformance, we borrowed a lot as a country internationally, and so we've had large servicing costs on that net external liabilities over this whole period. What's happened though over the last 10 to 20 years is that net international income deficit has narrowed, and that's left more income available to New Zealand residents. There seem to be a couple of key drivers behind this. One is falling global interest rates, which has favoured us as a borrower. That seems to account for about half of this. The other half is actually New Zealand reducing its net international liabilities. So they've fallen a fair bit, I think around from 80% to around 50% of GDP over this period. So potentially that reflects New Zealanders in some ways choosing to save some of this extra income growth we've had over this period. Although some of it possibly reflects luck again with favourable revaluations when you dig into it a bit more. Finally, we have the change in the depreciation burden. So this just shows the change in the ratio of depreciation to gross national income. So most countries have seen an increase of a few percentage points of GNI over this period. New Zealand's, on the other hand, has been broadly flat. So in one sense, that leaves more income available to New Zealanders to consume while maintaining our capital stock. And there could be various stories behind this. Some good, some not so good. One good story might be that we're efficient in our use of capital and don't need to have as much as other countries. A potentially less good one is that there's been a lot of work done looking at New Zealand's the adequacy of New Zealand's capital stock and infrastructure, and we seem to be relatively light on both those things. So potentially well-being would be better if we had a higher capital stock and bore the cost of that depreciation burden. But yeah, there's various possible stories going on behind there. So just in the last few minutes, I want to talk about some ways we see this increased income growth impact broader macroeconomic outcomes. So one of those is wages. So this shows New Zealand's annual average wage for a full-time equivalent employee as a percent of other countries. So there hasn't been as much catch-up here as on real net national income. There's various reasons for that. It's an hourly metric rather than a per capita. But what you do see is at least a bit of catch-up in New Zealand relative to the G7 from the late 90s to 2019, and actually a little bit of catch-up relative to Australia from the point when the gap was biggest, both in the year 2000 and in the last mining boom, 2011-ish. So that suggests that some of this is flowing through into economic outcomes experienced by New Zealanders. Another one is net migration of New Zealand citizens. So a concern with productivity growth for a long time was the large outflow of New Zealand citizens choosing to move overseas, especially to Australia, which is the blue, green and black lines there, various measures of movement to Australia, but also to other countries in the orange line there, particularly the UK, a bit to North America, a bit to Europe and other places. So what you've seen in that net immigration of New Zealand citizens to other countries is a reduction in that. There was a pretty persistent outflow prior to the early 2000s, and that seems to have abated back to around balance. With Australia, we're seeing a bit more of an outflow emerge post-COVID, back to around its historic average. But that's happened despite the Australian labour market being extremely hot. It was hot and reasonably hot in 2018, 2019, and it's been very hot recently. So perhaps that slight narrowing in the wage gap has attenuated that flow at the margin. But certainly there's the higher wages and higher incomes in Australia do look set to continue to attract people overseas, given current differences there. Finally, there's the real exchange rate on the left. So for New Zealand, through New Zealand's period of underperformance, that sat at a low level, cycling around the time New Zealand's economic performance seemed to improve in the late 90s, 2000s, and after there, the exchange rate lifted to what seems in hindsight to have been a persistently higher level. So that seems consistent with the New Zealand economy performing a bit better after that period. And there's on the right is New Zealand's net foreign liabilities, which I mentioned before has been trending down for the last decade or two. So just to wrap up, I want to talk about what this means for the future. So this chart here shows a breakdown of New Zealand's cumulative growth in real gross national income per capita from the 1995 to 2002 average. And it includes the Treasury forecasts from the latest budget back in May. And so, like I've talked about, there was some growth in real GDP per hour worked over this period. It's been supported a lot by more people entering employment in purple. A bit of a drop in hours worked per employee, but not massive, and then a bit of support from the terms of trade and net international income. So going forward, it's not clear how much we can rely on these other sources of income growth to keep lifting our per capita incomes. There's going to be a limit to how much of the population we can have in work eventually. The terms of trade can be fickle, like they might continue to go in our favour. We might be able to adapt to the world around us, but it can move around quite a lot and quite abruptly. And net international income is expected that deficit's expected to widen a bit in the future with interest rates increasing and the net international investment position widening a bit again. So that really turns our attention back to productivity growth, real GDP per hour worked. The Treasury's forecasts here have it going at roughly the last 30-year average, partly supported by slower growth in the share of the population in work, with firms focusing back on lifting productivity of their existing workforce. But yeah, that will be important for New Zealand to do what it can to support productivity growth if we're to see incomes continue to grow at the pace we've experienced over the last 20-ish years. So that's all I had to say on my slides. I'll hand back to Karen.
Kia ora, Matt. That was really fascinating presentation, and particularly I think your last slide there really raises some interesting questions about how do we sustain improvements in income over time, given that is a key way of lifting living standards as well. So thank you very much. So I'm now pleased to invite Philip to speak. Philip will be discussing the key areas of productivity in Aotearoa, as well as challenges and opportunities for our productivity improvement. He will explain how the interplay of productivity, employment, international trade, and income trends is shaping our economy. Thanks very much, Philip. I will be keeping an eye on the time. It is 20 minutes. You will get a wave. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou, everybody. As somebody interested in performance measures, it's the first time I've been to Treasury and there was a queue at the toilets. So obviously Matt's a great draw. So thanks, Matt. That was a really great piece of work. And if only it had come out 6 months earlier, it would have saved us a great deal of work. But what you have done is saved me having to talk about the first half of this voluminous publication that you'll have hopefully picked up on the way through, Productivity by the Numbers. This is like a biennial piece of work. So there's 3 of them now, so it's now a trend. So that we produce at the Productivity Commission, looking into New Zealand's productivity performance, and it's part of our responsibility to create and enable a well-informed public debate about productivity and productivity-related issues. So I hope you'll enjoy that. There's a lot of stuff in there. Can't cover it all today, but say Matt's covered a great deal of it. So I'm going to focus on the bits that kind of aren't in Matt's talk, and also to kind of help us have a bit of a discussion, because we've had some great talks in this series, you know, this is sort of, I don't know how close we are coming to the end of the whole series, but we're kind of start being a bit reflective now as well. So I'm going to talk about some of the kind of determinants type things as well. So productivity by the numbers is what I'm summarizing in part. So as we heard from Matt, you know, we lag behind other small advanced economies, kind of whatever measure we use, really. I mean, income's been rising faster, but it's not clear whether this is a temporary or a permanent effect. So, you know, we can only remove fixed prices and import controls once, and so, you know, it could well be that you know, our entrepreneurial farmers have successfully shifted from using our sunshine and rain to growing small to medium-sized mammals, shaving their fur off and selling their meat, to growing slightly larger mammals and milking them and selling their meat. So that was clearly a shift that we could make in response to international prices. It's not entirely clear whether or not we can make the same shift, say, if the prices of fridges goes up or something like that. So we have to be, the point is made that it could be fickle. So far we've done well. Our entrepreneurs have responded to those prices, but we have to hope that they can continue to do that and also design policy so that that's the case. I'm reminded of the historical precedent of the European growth that was developed from stealing silk from China in staffs. I believe they used to poke the little things in there and take them back to grow their silk trade. Let's hope China doesn't work out how to grow cows, because the trade works like that sometimes. So because of that, so I'm despite all these income effects, which are great, and they are generally welfare increasing, I'm going to focus on the back to GDP per hour again, because that's one thing that we can kind of work out and think about. So having pressed that twice, so here's the kind of starting point. I think last time we did actually have working smarter, not harder. So for those of you who can't see, we've got a graph here which has got on the vertical axis hours worked per employee, and again being aware that this is including numbers of people working as well as the hours they work, and GDP per hour worked on the horizontal axis. So we've color coded this because the OECD keeps changing. So the OECD has evolved over the years to bring in more and more economies that are possibly less like what we perceive ourselves to be in our peers. So we'll have to be a bit careful with OECD averages and stuff. So I've color coded the earliest stage OECD countries. Sorry, those of you online, I'm pointing at the bottom right quadrant, and those of you in black and white, the red balls behind the brown one. So here's where Norway, Denmark, Belgium, Switzerland, Luxembourg, all these kind of countries are. Even Italy, who we've just overtaken in the income, I saw. So we can be more like, so we can be proud of that. But then all the newer accession countries, Costa Rica, Chile, Mexico, all up in this top left-hand quadrant, lots of hours and not much output. So we're kind of on that threshold between the two. So we're getting closer to this cross line here, which is the OECD average, but it's as much because the OECD average is also changing as well as us as well. So and I think we kind of feel like we'd like to be there, notwithstanding the comment about bringing more people into the labour market, because again, if work is a good thing, and some of us are lucky to have jobs that we actually enjoy, then enabling people to have that income is a good thing. That's assuming that again that they're spread. The people getting those jobs are the people who kind of need them in inverted commas, and we're not just getting job-rich families, for example. There's other reasons why there might be other issues there. But if we're bringing in more people into the labour market and these people are lower productivity, there's a kind of average effect, and that's it seems to me a kind of a good thing. And so this story wasn't always the case. So we like some most productivity analysis uses like 10-year trends. So we're going to go back to 1870 here. We can't do it per hour for this because we just don't have the data, but we can do it per person. And that kind of looks a bit more like those kind of starting to look like those income per person kind of measures as well. So back in the 1870s, when we were in a free trade area effectively with the UK, Canada and Australia, we were kind of at the frontier of and that's not a scale effect. If you blow this up, we see ourselves up at the frontier. And so that long story that you'll see there is basically of us kind of being pretty much near the frontier until the Second World War, really, where we all start increasing. Nothing like a good war to get technological change happening, and hopefully there's nothing like peace to get consumption and good things happening. But what happened is in about 1970, as Matt pointed out, there's a kind of bifurcation here when we start moving away from the rest of these countries that we're kind of pairing ourselves to here. And so we've dropped below them now over here in the 60s, 70s. We've stayed fairly flat compared to these guys shooting off. And then again, as Matt has pointed out, we start kind of carrying on at the same kind of rate. Now, economists kind of like to talk about convergence. So the reason why you might be a long way away from the frontier is because you haven't implemented all the kind of ways of working that they have. But that's kind of that they're there now. Those ideas exist. So we often say, economies we expect them to converge if they can start importing these ways of working, etc., and kind of catching up. So we certainly haven't been converging with the rest of the world by learning from them. We've just been tagging along alongside them. If you want to know what convergence looks like, here's South Korea. So apart from a brief period here where we didn't measure output, we had more important things to be thinking about. They've invested large amounts of capital and skills and all sorts of things, and they have shot up and indeed overtaken us now. So my great uncle was in the Korean War. And if you showed him the Korea to today compared to that, it would have been a very different place. So that's what convergence looks like, and that's what sort of hanging behind everybody else kind of looks like. So there's lots of graphs behind that. Just before I go on, I kind of wanted to do just a little quick bit of economic theory to help us kind of think about what's going on about this. Because when people use the word productivity, there's lots of different uses they use. Even within economics, they kind of focus on one of these uses. So the kind of components of productivity, the things, the mechanisms through which the things that we may end up talking about operate are economies of scale. So generally speaking, if you've got one machine and one person working on it, and you get two people working on that machine, it becomes kind of more efficient. But at some point, it gets very inefficient having lots of people around that machine. This can happen at the individual level. So if I spend, like my kids know this, that they spend 3 hours working on one subject, they learn a lot more than if they spend 10 minutes on each when they're revising. So that's economies of scale, and it's sort of growing into economies of scope. So New Zealand is small and a long way away. We're not going to change that without plate tectonics or the kind of migration that would probably lead to the end of our society. Yeah. So we're going to suffer from those issues. We can't necessarily change that. We just need to understand what they are, and say these can happen at the system level. So if you think about agglomeration, if you think about labour market thickness, that's also economies of scale. Economies of scope is doing two things together is more efficient than doing them together. So if I make a cow, I make a cow, I grow a cow, or whatever the right verb is. That cow has got a nice skin that I can make a leather jacket out, and it's got some meat in there as well. So doing those two things together is more efficient than doing them separately. It may well be that doing certain types of business together. So we may have, for example, a metals industry that leverages off the fact that we've got a large dairy industry that needs big metal tanks, for example. Technical efficiency. So basically, from an economics perspective, this is the distance from the frontier. So this is basically how much are you producing given what you're using, given the current technology. We can think about this from an input or an output perspective. We can say, given the inputs we're using, we could be getting a whole lot more output. Or equivalently, you could say for the amount of output we're getting, we could use a lot less input to do that. So again, often the argument's about one of those things and not the other. It's usually productivity is about working harder to get more kind of stuff out. But you can choose to have the same amount of input and get the same amount of output and use less input, for example. Keynes suggested that we'd all be doing 20-hour weeks by now, but like many of his predictions, that didn't work. That's technical efficiency. And often we're talking in economic textbooks when we're talking about aspects of being inside the production frontier. Anyone who's done 101 economics would have seen a production frontier and have said we're somewhere in here, but we could get further out. That's that. Allocative efficiency is about producing the outputs and using the inputs appropriately given their relative prices. So if relative prices are telling us about the relative value to society, allocative efficiency is about them being allocated by the economy in a way that maximizes our well-being. Okay, this can stop if we interfere with markets. So if we put fixed prices on things or whatever, it stops the economy allocating resources, because it's an astonishing. The economy is one of those things. It's a bit like the joke about the fish in the water. They don't realise it's there until you really looked at it and thought about how all these thousands and millions of goods get allocated backwards and forwards. It's an astonishing system, and it's kind of prices that are doing that because they're telling us about the relative value of how much I want something and how much I'm willing to part with it. If those prices aren't right, this won't happen. Yeah, so we could be enjoying less of the benefits of life and disenjoying the disadvantages of life. So, for example, if we don't price something like, say, carbon or nitrogen runoff, yeah, it's effectively got a zero price. We will allocate we'll allocate our production inefficiently. And the last one, and the big one on the long term, is knowledge and technology, yeah? So the reason why we are enjoying the lives we are today compared to people 1,000 years ago is not because we're working harder, it's not because we're more efficient at hunting caribou, yeah, or collecting herbs, yeah? It's because we found new things to do and new ways to do them, yeah? So if you look at something like, say, the life expectancy, yeah, it carried on about 28 from about 30,000 years ago till about 1,000 years ago, yeah? And then it starts shooting up. And basically, we started learning about things like how to do health properly, and medical advances and stuff. This is what economic growth is, yeah? Thinking of new things to do and new ways to do them. So in a lifetime when the average life expectancy was 28, we've learned all about drugs, we've learned all about medicine, etc., and sanitation, all sorts of those things. That's what's in economic growth as well, yeah? So that's a huge part of it. And how that knowledge, and it's not just things to do, but also ways to do them, spreads around the economy is a really important part. And finally, mismeasurement. So most of the statistics we talk about are mismeasured because we can't measure everything perfectly, yeah? So, for example, the national accounts make some assumptions about how economies work, and basically you've got labour inputs, capital inputs, and everything else in multi-factor productivity. So a lot of the time we spend is explaining things away that we couldn't measure properly, like changes in skills, changes in knowledge. There's a kind of constant race between the technology of producing national accounts and the things that we do in order to measure them. So we now measure things like R&D and some intangibles, which we didn't used to measure, but now we do. So that's getting a bit better. But then we find new things to do and mismeasurement. So Moses Abramovich famously called productivity a measure of our ignorance. So we also need to remember that as well. There's stuff that's not in the measure. So think about that when we're talking on. Anyway, so here's another way to think about it that we set out in the productivity by the numbers. It's just a kind of schematic kind of way, if you like, pictures. So basically, material living standards is a function of the things that we can buy, those materials that we can buy, goods and services. That can depend on, primarily, we can depend on income that we get abroad or income that we give abroad. As Matt noted, we're now giving away less money than we used to abroad, and that's kind of one thing. And then there's our ability to produce goods and services. So capital, labour, multi-factor productivity, machines and IT and stuff, people and everything else. Yeah, so we can measure things like the participation rate, hours worked per employee, the kind of plant and machinery we've got. And in this area here, there's a whole lot of stuff that we don't measure in things like the national accounts. So some of these intangible capitals we do, but not all of them. We don't measure social capital. Now we've got living standards framework, we're starting to think about those kind of things, because if I don't trust you, it's very hard for me to do a market exchange with you. So until if you want to understand the importance of social capital, go to a country where people daren't start businesses up because they think their profits will be expropriated by the state. Yeah, so trust is a really important fundamental of market economies. Environmental capital, again, we've got an agricultural economy, much more agricultural than others. So if we run down that capital, then our ability to exploit it goes down. Things like business practices, the skills of the workforce, and things like innovations. All of these are unmeasured in there. And then underlying all of this, we've kind of got this is sort of a grab bag of stuff, basically, that underpins all these kind of things. So how well does our innovation system function? How well are our investment and capital markets working? How well are our international linkages working? We're a small economy. We can't make everything. Again, you just need to look at when we tried to do that, what the economy looked like. Roger Proctor used to tell me stories about people going over to Japan with suitcases and bringing back valves or TVs being imported and pulled apart and put back together again. That's what happens when you don't have international trade. The gains of trade are massive. And again, Matt's just shown us that, how our incomes have improved from trading with people who get to do some of that stuff better than we can do. Infrastructure, so we're a small country, we're low population, but we're spread out. So how well our infrastructure works, and that's become really crucial, obviously, recently. How our business dynamics work, our skills and education system. My ability to be productive is in large part a function to that education I somehow managed to wangle out of a university, and the institutions that we build. The background framework that drives how the economy functions. So that's the kind of stuff we try and have a look at. I'll look at some of them today, but not all of them, because I've only got 5 minutes left. And so here's a few of them, just to kind of cover those off. So our investment's pretty low. So R&D, we're down here with Poland and Ireland and Spain and Greece. We kind of we feel like we want to be over there. Again, if knowledge is how we get better. And again, even if we think about things like our agricultural sector, a lot of our agricultural sector is built on investments that we made in, things really exciting, things like plant types and stuff. It's great coming from another country and watching TV and on primetime TV, seeing like, stuff to pour on grass to grow your output. But that stuff comes from research. We have particular climate. We need to think about that. We're thinking about methane emissions, etc. That can be dealt with by R&D. This is actually increasing slightly, but it's still at a pretty low base. If you looked at our overall, so this is on the right-hand panel here, we've got fixed capital formation. If you looked at our overall one, we looked kind of in the normal. But if you look at this, break it down into parts. This is machinery, equipment, and IT. So this is the things that we can work with in order for ourselves to be highly productive. And this is what 100 years of economic development was kind of built off. We're sort of again way down here with Australia, and so there's a lot of countries with higher ones. The reason why we look more in the pack overall is because of our investment in housing. Yeah, and I suspect, I'm not a specialist in this area, but that looks like a price effect to me. So we're investing a lot of money in housing and not getting a lot out, because our housing stock should be expanding given how much we're spending on it. So there might be some issues there. Again, that's not my particular special areas, but there's lots of people who are very interested in that sort of stuff. So in some areas, it's actually negative. Yeah, so I talked about environmental capital. Yeah, so we are, according to this measure from the World Bank, we're disinvesting in our capital. We're running down our capital stock. So if it was a machine, yeah, I'd be running it down. So eventually it's going to break, yeah, and I won't be able to produce my stuff with it anymore. So, I mean, obviously Australia is digging a lot more out of it out and selling it first. So, but it's worth thinking about that. This is a capital, yeah. So how do we think about how we're using that and running that down? And is that because, say, the prices are wrong, for example? Okay, in terms of where that finance comes from, we've got a relatively, so our share market is relatively small. Again, there's a cause and effect issue here. It may well be that because we don't have many productive firms, they don't need that. There's no shares being sold. It could be that they're selling offshore, etc. But compared to these guys over here, yeah, Sweden, US, we've got a very small share market. So that's telling us something. Venture capital, again, it's different types of finance are often important at different stages of a firm's advancement. And along with these finances also come other skills as well, don't forget. So that's one of the reasons why we have these different types of sections of the finance market, because they're good at doing, say, high risk, high return versus low risk, low return, etc. But they also bring kind of management and capability with them. Again, we're kind of somewhere in the middle here. Israel is kind of actually off the chart, although it's off the chart with quite a few things that maybe we don't want to aspire to that. Again, it's sort of small or middling there. And as we've always noticed, for a long time, our interest rates were pretty damn high. Again, I had to check twice when I first came here. And again, if capitalism is fundamentally based on people investing in something in order to get something back in the future. Yeah, if you can't retain profits because you're relatively small on average, or you're new, yeah, you need to borrow it off somebody. So if it's expensive to borrow, then it's harder to, the tide has to be higher. So quickly moving on, because Matt, as I mentioned these, generally speaking, our business friend, it's very easy to start a company in this country. And market entry is a really important part of a well-functioning economy. But the actual capability of our businesses themselves are low. This is, I'm afraid, a very old study because we haven't done it again. But this is the Management Matters study, where they're basically economists and business people have looked at what capabilities actually make manufacturing firms more productive, not which ones are selling well at the bookshop at the airport. And basically, we're kind of low to middling. I haven't put them all on here because it would look even more depressing. But we're kind of, again, with Poland and Portugal down here. And interestingly, it's the human resources management where we lack the most, which is kind of you might want to kind of affect. So this is both growing high performers. So you might say this might be a kind of high poppy thing, and it's also dealing with low performance. Again, somebody who's not performing well in a firm is not good for the person. It's not good for the firm. Yeah. So that's an important part of management. And then the rest of it you probably already know. Our education, our maths, science, and English are declining. Compared to, we started off pretty well, but we're now starting to decline. You might argue that's becoming more important now in a society where science and disinformation are becoming important. And you might argue that maybe PISA measures the wrong kind of stuff. A lot of people do. So maybe physics is different in New Zealand, you know, because we're upside down. Maybe gravity works differently. But we actually do, one of the few areas of education where we measure well is a national monitoring study, which takes the curriculum, such as it is, and tries to work out what it would look like if performance was high. And here, what I'm showing here is about the disparities between educational backgrounds. Okay, and so in economics, we think about the first and second law of welfare economics. Yeah, if you have an unequal society, one of the best ways to do that is ensure people have good starting conditions. Yeah. Education is an investment in our people. The people who might benefit the most from that education appear to be getting less out of it across all areas, apart from Te Reo Māori. And that tells you something about the structure of the education system, as well as the great work that's been done in terms of that aspect of the curriculum. But there are some hideous numbers in there about lost opportunity in there. So already said institutions are strong. We trust our government more than lots of other people. And we've done some work in the Productivity Commission, which you can read. It's not in Productivity by the numbers, but I wanted to sell it. Basically, our headline is, productivity is a long game. Yeah, it depends on the investments we make. And that's going to affect, where we are today, depending on where we came from, and where we're going to depends on what we do today. There's been a great review on how innovation policy might be done by the Frontier Firms review team, and Jeff's here, and he can tell you all about it. But particularly interesting, I would say, is the fact that we were asked to do a follow-up review to say, how did government respond to our suggestions? Because they may be all stupid ideas. We don't know, because no one's tried them yet, except a lot of these are based on other countries where they have done those things. And so, in summary, it's kind of be more coordinated. Government should choose some high-level areas, but the governance should be such that the actual projects that are funded are actually come from the bottom up, come from businesses and whatever, because they know what they're doing. Yeah, asking someone like me to choose the next investment project is a really stupid idea. Yeah, and I've got a pretty good education. Yeah, so people who are thinking about markets, about what people want, what's feasible, they should be making those kind of decisions. Okay, but also, this is the thing I want to leave you on, is we also talk about monitoring and evaluation. So the government is quite a large part of the economy. It's important for multiple reasons. One, it's big. Yeah, I mean, you can measure it in lots of different ways, but it's pretty damn big. Two, the things it does are really important. Things like institutions, education are really important. And three, the people who are affected by it not going well are often the people who are least able to deal with it. So I can afford to send my kids to private school if I don't like the schooling I get, or I can get I've got opportunities others don't. So knowing how well it's working and evaluating that and learning how it works is a really important thing. So how can we think about government in a different way to be productivity enhancing in the way that, say, the private sector might be? So the private sector wouldn't say, here's an issue, we need to solve that. Okay, we'll go and ask some guys to go away. That's a non-gendered term, guy. Go away, have a really good think. They'll make a suggestion. We'll choose the best one, and then we'll just leave it. Yeah, no business would work like that. Yeah, most first versions of products are terrible. Yeah, because they learn as they're doing. Yeah, they observe how the market responds to it. Yeah, they use the information that they're available. So there's a great opportunity there for the business of government to be done better, because it's socially good and it's economically good. That seems like a good way to finish. So thank you. Good night. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And you almost kept to time. So big thanks for that. And I love that productivity is a long game. And I think that's a really important thing to remember as we go into the Q&A session. So if you just bear with us for just a couple of minutes, we will just rearrange the room so we can start the Q&A session. We'll be doing this online and in the room. So please bear with me on that as well too. I'll be monitoring chat as well as looking around the room. I think we've probably got about half an hour for Q&A, so a good time for the discussion.
Shall I ask my comms person? Shall I sit in front of the Podcom flag?
I think that's a very good idea, because all those social media shots will be fantastic. Can you stop that?
There you go. Bit of competition going here. Yeah, that's what we like to see.
Great. Thank you very much for the fascinating presentations. I think this is going to be a great Q&A. So I might just start with a couple of questions for Matt, if that's all right, since you were the first presenter. To what extent do you think the rising terms of trade has been influenced by external events beyond New Zealand's control, as opposed to decisions being made by New Zealanders?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's a bit of a mixture. So a lot of it clearly is external developments outside of our control. Global commodity prices have increased for food and other resources, and that's favoured New Zealand. The rise of China and globalisation have helped with that. But I think there is definitely an adaptation element. Like the world changes, and then people, New Zealand firms and the government and households choose how they respond to that. So I think it's a mixture of both, and it's a bit iterative. I think that's something that would be worth definitely looking more into, and exactly like how much of it has been adaptation and how much of it has been good fortune.
Thank you. And I think that's a nice follow on. One more question from online from Paul Conway, which is, if I can get it right, while some of the dynamics in Matt's excellent presentation are clearly positive, are we setting ourselves up for high prosperity and well-being going forward? And I think this is, how will we achieve Treasury's optimistic forecast for productivity growth going forward if we aren't investing in capital, especially since technology is often embedded in capital goods? I might go to Philip first and then maybe back to Tim with that one as well too.
So, I mean, the past has already happened. So, I mean, we can't deny that we benefited from those terms of change, for example, benefits. And I think there is a degree of the fact that we unleashed the economy to allow people to adapt to that. I think you have to be careful about, if your business model relies on factors beyond your control, then you have to be really careful. Yeah. So it could well, the worry. I mean, I can certainly remember like a decade ago, people were worried about air miles, for example, and suddenly it was like, well, actually, we're selling lovely green fields and whatever, but actually people are seeing aeroplanes with our stuff on. And as an economist, we were talking about, well, yeah, but if we're a hell of a lot more efficient, actually, the net effect may be we're still more. It's still better to get it from us and ship it than it is to do it from some, do it indoors in a shed in Holland or somewhere. But the market is what's determining that. So I think we have to be kind of careful in doing that. In the past, generally speaking. So allow yourself to be responsive to those external environments and make sure you're set up so that you do enable firms to adjust quickly. We've got pretty good institutions to enable all of that stuff and flexible labour markets, etc. So that enables that. On the other side of the coin, we need to be aware that there are costs with that as well as a society. So we'd say, well, that labour adjustment is good from a firm's perspective and maybe from an overall perspective, but in an individual person, if you're not able to adjust or you're paying the cost, we need to think about how we manage that. But generally speaking, most of our lives that we enjoy today have come from investing in stuff. Yeah. And so, maybe the world has changed, but I don't think so. I think the problems we're trying to solve may change, but ultimately it's people finding new things to do and new ways to do them in effective ways is how we've got to where we are today, both good and bad. And I think a lot of the solutions that we have to where we are and where we want to go in the future will come from that as well.
Thanks, Kia ora, Paul. Thanks for the question on the forecast, which I'll speak to a little bit more specifically. I mean, it's as you'd know, forecasting is in some ways a mug's game. So what we're trying to do is, you're exactly right that the productivity forecast is predicated on things like the investment forecast, and then which begs the question, well, how do you determine what people are going to invest in? And I think as Philip said in his presentation, well, we sitting in Wellington wouldn't know anything about that. What we really depend on is for the trend in the private sector in innovation and in capital formation to continue like it has for many decades, and that's really the basis of the forecast. We can't predict exactly what people are going to invest in and how productive it is and how innovative, etc. But what we can do is say that, well, history has shown that over long periods of time, these investment rates do continue at a certain level, total factor productivity continues at a certain rate, and will expect to see that in the future, even though we might not, be very specific about exactly what people are going to invest in, because that's really their business, not ours.
That's great. Thank you very much. I might just do one more online question and just put this one to Matt. So the question is that much of the data that's been presented today are averages or medians. Are there any insights data on the distribution under the averages? Are some people working harder, or are there any patterns underneath the average? And I know that in some of your work that you did look at what the labour market was actually absorbing when we were sort of increasing the numbers of hours worked in New Zealand. So I wonder if you could just elaborate that on that a little bit more, Matt.
Yeah, so the main focus of the paper was on averages, and I definitely acknowledge that that's a limited angle just to make the paper tractable to actually write and finish. But yeah, on the labour market side, what we do seem to have seen in New Zealand is in that strong employment growth, we've disproportionately brought, well, there's some evidence at least over this period out of Motu, that the labour market's drawn in lower wage workers on average. So that would suggest that people who were otherwise might have not otherwise been in the workforce have had the opportunity to enter work. So that development has probably been favourable, and it's probably also at the margin lowered our average productivity growth over the past 20 years. There isn't probably heaps more I can say on that. There's an element as well, and a big element in New Zealand as well, on how the housing market interacts with the labour market, and so even if we've seen favourable developments in the labour market, there's a risk that some of those may have been offset by trends in the housing market. But yeah, we've also over the last 10 years seen, as I mentioned, higher wage growth at the low skill end. So that would suggest at least over the last decade, there's been that favourable development as well.
I'm going to go to the audience now, and I've forgotten to look at my notes, and I'm sure I was supposed to say something else. But when you stand up, if you have a question, put your hand up. Could you just say who you are and where you're from would be really, really helpful. Going to the back first, and then we'll come to you after that. Is that all right? Thank you.
Test.
Yep. Hi, Roger Tweedy. My interest around work and age, and the graphic on age participation was intriguing. The growth of over 55-year-old women is fantastic, but the one, if we take the view of the long game, was the participation of males 15 to 24, I think, which was absolutely abysmal. Can you talk about that in terms of the long game? Thanks.
Sorry, I made a rookie mistake and forgot we only have one microphone. Who would like to answer that question? Tim, you have a first go at that one. Thank you.
Sure. I think that I noticed that statistic as well. Was it corrected for enrolment in formal education? Because we know that enrolment rates have been increasing. It's just raw. So part of it could be just people persisting longer in tertiary education. But
yeah, so I think it seems to be a bit of a global trend, seeing reduced employment among young men. And the good news, at least for New Zealand, is that our reduction in the share of young men in employment has been smaller than other countries, but certainly, to the extent that young men aren't either in education or work, that would be a concern. And on the participation of older people, that is one area where New Zealand really stands out. So we have had much stronger growth in the share of the population aged over 55 in work. So that has been an interesting development and has supported New Zealand's incomes on average, at least.
Did you have anything you wanted to add on that, Philip? All good. Right, we'll go over here. Thank you.
I'm a policy advisor at the Ministry of Transport, and I have a question for you. Do you have any data in terms of artificial intelligence and what the implications may be in regards to the future? Thank you.
I might go to Philip for that one. Is that all right?
Or is it Philip? So, I mean, this is kind of where that predicting anything, especially the future, is really difficult. So, There is some work kind of coming out, certainly in the economics area, looking at some of this stuff. So Syverson, who came to talk here, or rather virtually came here, and Brynolfsson and others. There's been some really kind of, so it looks like it might be what economists call a general purpose technology, which kind of has long-term impacts in unforeseen ways. So a lot of the other big things that we, that those kind of inventions happen, we had no idea. You couldn't have foreseen what was going to be the outcome, because you had to actually fundamentally change your production models and stuff. So what some of the earlier works showed, which has been quite interesting, is that a lot of technology shocks up until now have been, if you think about over time, originally they kind of de-skilled the workforce for some people. So God, I hope that wasn't me. No, it's not. I thought mine was on mute. So they kind of took a lot of craftsmen out and replaced those with kind of manufacturing, and then they generally became sort of skill biased. So the people who benefited the most from a lot of the new technologies were skill biased. There seems to be evidence this might go the other way. So if you imagine what AI can do is things like, if what as a lawyer you do is you basically learn case law and tort, for example, suddenly remembering loads of stuff, and finding it quickly may not be as valuable as it used to be. It's not to say that there's also, having our justice system not in charge. I've seen Judge Dredd, so having not having people in the and aspects of that are still, but there seems to be a sign of that happening. So there's been some work looking at, say, marketing companies and stuff, where basically what's the benefits have happened to the lowest skilled people, because they are able, so they understand enough about the business to be able to know what good looks like, but they haven't got the experience and knowledge to just gain all of those little factoids. So what it appears to be doing is, in a way that's supervised, because anyone who's played with ChatGPT or anything else will know that it's not learning, you are. You're learning how to use it, how to ask it good questions, because the stuff that most of us were using is trained on a data set that isn't changing. So what's happening is we're learning how to use it better, and understanding the context of the business seems to be important. So in those cases, it's kind of been, in a sense, progressive, because it's allowed people with knowledge of the business and the market, but not so deep technical knowledge, as it were, to actually gain some of that sort of stuff, which, to me, if that's lifting everybody up, that seems to be a kind of hopeful thing. But it's an emergent non-linear system, and it's almost impossible to predict. So I've got absolutely no idea really how it will go. So economists can talk a lot about what they don't know.
Great. Thank you very much. I recently came back from the Economic Policy Committee at the OECD, where AI was very much a hot topic, and I'd say there was very split views across the membership in terms of what the impacts might be. I think down at the back, that might be the last question for the room, and then I'll do another couple more online as well too. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou, ko Eden Skipper-Tukuonga from Manatū Ahumātua MPI. The question that I've got is, how do these numbers reflect the needs of Aotearoa in terms of thinking about, say, the living standards framework or He Ara Waiora? So how do we compare on those metrics? And then I guess one of the other areas of focus in terms of that question is, how are we comparing with looking at climate finance and the agriculture towards a transition? So we know that obviously that's a big part of emissions in our economy, and we know that we need to transition, but what does the numbers say in that space towards supporting that transition? So sort of two questions.
That's great. Thank you. Very topical questions. I might pass on to Tim for those ones, if that's okay.
Sure, thanks for the question. Well, I think these are all, well, Matt can speak to this probably better than I can actually, is they are, the numbers in his paper were chosen to reflect numbers that are comparable between New Zealand and the rest of the world. So they are all New Zealand numbers, and we're interested in the dimensions of New Zealand that matter to New Zealanders. But one of the premises, I guess, of doing the sort of work is that we can learn something from countries that are similar to us in some dimensions, countries that are different to us in some dimensions. I guess it's our business to understand the sort of generalities we can apply to the New Zealand case. On the emissions data and things like R&D and emissions, hopefully Philip may be able to speak to that, because I don't have any particular insight in that one.
Yeah, I'll just make a comment on the living standards dimension to my paper. So yeah, the living standards framework covers off obviously a wide range of areas important for well-being. Probably two areas that my paper would comment on particularly is the income growth dimension. So obviously New Zealand incomes have been growing reasonably well, so that's a good thing for living standards. And on the employment growth side, that's another part of the living standards framework. I think it's, even though a lot of people are in work because they need to be, there are also, the research indicates that there are a lot of benefits to being in work beyond the income it provides. Contributing to your community, social connection. And so New Zealand, I think my paper suggests New Zealand has been doing particularly well on those two dimensions. Yeah, that's probably, there's a lot of other dimensions to the living standards framework, so I won't go through all of them, but other Treasury work, such as the wellbeing report, touches on a wider range of aspects of living standards and how New Zealand's tracking.
Right. So we already have a living standards framework in the Aotearoa order, so the Productivity Commission decided not to create another one. So we refer to them in a sense that ultimately that's the ultimate game, is to be having good lives. And so where we've looked at is where that can feed into our focus of work. And that varies. So I'm talking about productivity by the numbers here, but there's also other aspects of our work as well. So I think one of the areas where we focused on was the kind of two-way relationship. So as any manager knows, a highly motivated staff are more productive than not motivated staff. They won't steal your paper and pens and stuff, and they'll come up with ideas and that sort of thing. So we know that there's a kind of well, it's not just about that. Human beings aren't just one of my favorite cartoons was our people are our greatest assets. I say we sell them. And so so it is important. I'm more productive when I'm in a job that I enjoy, and what well-functioning labour markets do is they allocate people to jobs that they like the most, given the skills that they have. So that's a really important part of a well-functioning, fluid, well-adjusting economy, is that people get to do a bit more of what they really want to be doing, and so I think that's an area where jobs have changed over the years. So my parents' generation worked until they dropped. And most of them hated their jobs. Some of them liked it, but most of them didn't. Actually, we've got better jobs now than we used to have, and part of that's because of the kind of health and safety and things that we put in place, the institutions we've built, but also because of we've gravitated towards things that are more like that. So from the Productivity Commission's perspective, we've focused on. So the great thing about markets are, when they're working well, is I don't need to know what makes you happy. I just need you to be able to say that and be able to express that through how much you work and where you buy your goods, etc. So most of the things that I've got no idea what my own kids think a lot of the time. So the idea of what makes them better off is quite frankly visible, and some of the things they do find enjoyable, I really I feel we ought to ban, but you become an autocrat when you're a parent. So I think so a well-functioning economy is good for well-being. We have to make sure that it doesn't exploit. We need to be careful that the benefits that come from some aspects of it, like for example reallocation of economic resources from one area to the other, have to be managed in a way that's kind of humane and enables people to live kind of fruitful sort of lives. But that's kind of where we are. Some of the questions that we get asked in our inquiries are broader than that, and so we need frameworks to kind of think about that. And because they already exist, we start with those to allow you to ask the right sort of questions. Because a lot of the things that governments are doing is because markets don't seem to be able to do them. So that's why government's involved. So we have to think about that more broadly, particularly in the business of government. But we have to be clear, and hopefully that's what will come out of this new kind of movement towards living standard frameworks. This stuff is to be clear what we think is going to happen, how it will happen, and whether or not it is occurring. Yeah, because it enables us to measure by outcome more than measure by output or activity. Because a lot of the time we still measure by how many widgets government sells, etc. Your other point was about sort of transitions and stuff. So again, I'm an economist, so my first thought is make sure the prices are right for everything. And people become, so there was a great talk at the New Zealand Association of Economists from a person who's done a lot of work on climate change, etc. And a well-priced, he was pointing out in countries with a well worked out carbon price, people find solutions. Yeah, I don't know what the solutions are, but they find them because they respond to the thing. This is they benefit from this. So if I get to dump all my nitrogen runoff into somebody's garden for nothing, I'll keep dumping it there. Yeah, if they start charging for me, I might start thinking differently about how I manage my resources. So that's a clear part of it. The difficulty with that transition stuff, I think, as well, is the cost of transition, because some people who are currently doing well will have to do worse off. Yeah, so this is not Pareto improving. Yeah, something will change, and that becomes a bit more difficult, and that's where we have to be careful with the democratic process, etc. But so the two caveats I would add to that is how that happens, what the cost of that transition is, and how we manage it. I've got a high degree of belief in the human ingenuity and to solve that problem if they're given the right incentives. But the third big problem, of course, is, again, this is another nonlinear system. Is it already too late? I can't answer that because that's the problem. Yeah, we could be the frog in boiling water, that we've already gone past it. That's a bigger problem. If that's the case, then those solutions may not work. But I'm still hopeful for our invention.
Just one other thing to add, because I have thought of something to say on this topic, which is it links to the observation in Matt's paper, or actually in both papers, about the terms of trade increase. So we've seen, a lot of the export price increase New Zealand has experienced has been a food price increase, of course. And if you believe, as I think many people do, that increasingly extreme weather will put pressure on food production systems around the world, then that's probably, I would guess, good for New Zealand, because the evidence suggests, tentatively, that New Zealand may be less vulnerable to increasingly extreme weather relative to the rest of the world. So we will become more vulnerable in absolute terms, of course. But I've seen some studies which suggest that our location in the globe and trade winds, etc., mean that we may be less impacted from an agricultural point of view than the rest of the world. So that's actually positive for New Zealand. Illustrates what Philip was just saying, is that these things are extremely complicated and non-linear, and I've probably been a fool for even trying to speculate about what might happen.
I might just ask a follow-up question to that, and then I might come back to you, Philip, with an R&D question as well. But just on that, we did have a question online about, I think there was a slide in your presentation, Philip, that showed the disinvestment in the natural capital, basically, and what impact that might have moving forward in terms of our ability to generate ongoing improvements in income and well-being too. And I know you did a little bit of work on that in Te Taiwaora, Tim, so I wondered whether you just wanted to have if you had any thoughts on that as well.
I'll go to Matt first. Since you...
Yeah, so I'm reasonably. Oh, sorry, what was the question again? Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so that metric, New Zealand was investing in some natural resources. I think that metric, Philip can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was mining resources, particularly, that New Zealand was disinvesting in. I suppose, yeah, that's we can only deplete resources once, so that's a negative for the long term. But New Zealand, compared to some of the other countries we like to compare ourselves to, particularly Australia on that metric, depletes far more resources. So that at least is a relative positive for us. I might pass on to Philip.
Yeah, so that to be frank, that was just an example, just to show the concept, because we were quite keen to kind of I mean, again, I'm an economist, so I see everything through economics glasses. And I feel I don't think there's a useful debate when we kind of go, this is the area of economics and everything else is I kind of think economics has stuff to bring to lots of areas, and I think the concept of if you disinvest in something, it won't be as productive in the future. So you may value it for other reasons apart from it being, I may never see a Kokako, but I'm very happy that they're there. Yeah, so there are other reasons why we might value those things, but certainly from a purely productive perspective, you can improve the measures that we've currently got to account for things that entirely fit within the frameworks of national accounts. So Arthur Grimes and Wu, for example, gave a presentation here with a similar kind of thing where they've taken a similar kind of measure and they've taken a net value of income. So we've got this income, but actually we've been disinvesting in all this kind of stuff. So again, if we had to pay for that stuff, it would have cost, we might make different choices. So yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I think depending on how because there's things like, as we're understanding how the biosphere works, yeah, again, it's another nonlinear system. So we kind of go, well, how do you think about, now we're pushing up against the edges of it. How would we value things like diversity, biodiversity? Yeah, because there may be aspects that we're not measuring just by measuring the amount of stuff we're digging out of the ground. Because in the end of the day, the problem with digging stuff out of the ground is if you burn it and it releases some stuff, and you just made a hole. Yeah, but getting rid of an entire species, or getting rid of things that we're discovering, like the mushrooms that we now discover are taking up a third of the carbon and we didn't even know they existed. Getting rid of those things that we didn't know existed, those are capital stocks. We get rid of them, and the problem is as you say, once you've got rid of them, you can't go to a shop and buy them again because they've already kind of gone. So yeah.
Got a couple of minutes. Let Tim have a couple
Sure.
of words on that, and then one last question after.
Yeah, look, I mean, the question is extremely apposite, I think. We, as Kieran said in our wellbeing report, we did cover this in some detail in an entire chapter, actually. So I think it's clear to pretty much everybody that there are at least pressure points, if not, areas of sort of collapse in various parts of the ecosystem that we need to be aware of. The interesting observation I'd make about some of the very long-term chart, or let's say the 20th century charts that are in the two papers, I know that many of those measures, if not all, I think, do not account for the depletion that happened in the 20th century of natural resources along the way. Maybe the minerals ones do, because you can measure minerals, how much you're digging out of the ground, but you do not. There weren't the technologies to measure the depletion of, let's say, biodiversity in indigenous forest. We're starting to develop those measures now, which is a very good thing, because I think we're becoming increasingly aware, as Philip says, of how important they are to supporting things like agriculture in the adjacent land areas, and even urban air quality and things like that we tend to take for granted.
Thank you very much. I'll take one last question from the room. If anyone has a burning question they would like to ask. Oh, everybody does. I don't know who to go to first. Where am I looking? Hands up again. I missed it. Okay, Bryce, we'll give the last word to you.
The last big work with policy prescriptions was the 2025 Task Force 2009-2010, which had a lot of details, a lot of concern about government regulation, sort of genetic modification, suppressing innovation possibilities for no good reason. But a really big one, an elephant in the room, it seems to me, is our Resource Management Act and its replacement. I've got a friend in the commercial community at the moment who's got 3 clients, and all of them have projects they're trying to get resource consent approvals for, and all of them are absolutely stymied. And the problem is they've got to apply to the relevant local government for a resource consent. And the local governments are telling them that they've got to consult iwi. And they're saying which iwi should we consult. And the local government won't tell them, because it's going to be controversial, because there'll be conflicts as to which iwis want to be consulted. So they've written to all of the possible relevant iwis, and they can't get them to reply. And there's no obligation to reply. So someone can want to consult you, but you're short of resources. You've got your own priorities. I mean, there's nothing wrong with this. I'm not criticizing iwi. I'm talking about the structure we've got. And if you get involved in this particular application, it might be very divisive internally, or it might set up a dispute with another iwi or something. So we're talking about productivity and innovation. Here we've got 3 examples, just anecdotal, but of a system which is fundamentally obstructive to being able to achieve anything.
Thanks very much for that challenging question to end. And I might just ask each of the speakers perhaps just to give their views on, I guess, what is the role of, I guess, well, what are the things that we could do that might actually help to unleash more productivity in New Zealand, including sort of potentially any unnecessary or compliance heavy type regulatory systems, etc. But perhaps if we end with each of you just giving a few words on what you think one or two of the biggest things we could do to sort of really unleash that productivity growth would be really, really helpful. Start with, where should we start? Tim, we'll start with you.
I'm happy to start. Yeah, I won't obviously wade into the anecdotes because I don't know the details of the individual case, but it's a very fair point that we always need to be looking at our regulatory systems and how well they balance their objectives with their unforeseen and unintended, at least, consequences, if not the unforeseen ones as well. As for one or two areas, well, I think both presentations made the point that everything follows from innovation and knowledge accretion. So I would say anything we can do to reverse those pretty concerning downward trends in achievement of basic skills, literacy, numeracy, science, has got to be a good thing because that underpins innovation. And when you have innovation, then capital investment and things like that will follow. Yeah, so that would be my pick.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Yeah, I'd support those comments as well around skills and building skills of our people. I think what I'd say though, in terms of New Zealand's productivity, is we're always going to have, or it seems likely that we're going to have a disadvantage from being distant from the main centres of global economic activity and being a small country. But we do have a lot of things that we seem to be doing well, and it's important we retain those. As much as it's important that we retain those as that we extend further on how we can improve things. So three things I'd say we are doing well. One is we have broadly, for all the challenging issues and around regulation and so on, we do broadly have very good institutions according to organisations like the World Bank, OECD, and we're very highly regarded in that respect. So it's important we retain those. Another thing we're doing well is our labour market, our job market seems fairly inclusive compared to some other countries. And although there's, of course, much that can be done to improve our labour market in some ways, it's important that we retain understand what is working well and retain that. And a third thing we seem to have done well is our international trade responsiveness in responding to global developments in our exports, on our imports particularly. So continuing our efforts to make the most of global opportunities, even in a more challenging geopolitical environment.
Okay, so Bryce, you don't need me to tell you that the Productivity Commission has been thinking about a lot of those things, and some of their solutions you may agree with and some you might not, but I think certainly aspects of the RMA, I think I won't quite, I heard Jeff talking to the OECD earlier about exactly this issue, so maybe people should talk to him about that because he remembers it better, but there's some great studies done there looking at exactly this problem, but I'll use it to raise a slightly broader issue that I mentioned before about the business of government. So a well-functioning economy and society needs good institutions. They need to be fit for purpose. They need to be tested. So what you're describing is a situation where I would suggest, well-meaning design went wrong, and we weren't learning as we were going along because there's a whole lot of complicated incentives going on in local government, in all the various aspects about what if I'm election cycles and who votes and all those kind of things all fit in, and where the assets lie, etc. So we should always be going back to the purpose and testing whether these things are doing what we intended them to do, and were there aspects of the situation that we didn't think about when we designed them. So it may well be that they kind of thought, we really need to take into account iwi here, so we'll put an iwi thing in there, and that solved that. And it's just and one of the things that we know about, if you read things like about how disasters happen, I can heartily recommend Cautionary Tales by Tim Harford, the economist, and he talks about work that basically says the problem with systems is that they're designed. not to enable people to operate in them. And so we design them with principles in mind, and we just don't think about how people are going to act when that. So what incentives has that person got to name those iwi, for example? And let's be clear. Iwi aren't against regional growth and etc. Instead, most of them that I've met are entirely for it because they want the best for their populations. Their focus might be slightly different, their worldview might be slightly different, but they still want that. They want that development to happen. And so, to me, I think it comes back to, are these regulations that we're creating doing what we think they should be doing? Are we learning something about them? And be open enough to say it's hard. Yeah, it's hard to get this right. Yeah, and then be able to kind of say, well, that doesn't quite work in the way we intended it to because that incentive's not working right. And the advantage I think the Podcom has maybe over some other departments is when we look at those situations, we get to look across multiple, because often these cases happen because you've got different parts of government designing different parts of a regulatory system, and they don't fit together. That's one of the outcomes of the Frontier Firms Review, is to say, don't have your skills policy and your R&D policy focusing in different areas, because your R&D is going to produce businesses that no one can populate because they haven't got the skills for it, and you have loads of people with skills that can't work in businesses and use them, so they go abroad. It's another case of that kind of joined upness. So it may well be that often, and again, I don't know the situation, but often it's the case where one set of regulations about, I don't know, what capital a local government can have on its books, or how it manages the risk, the forward risk of getting it wrong when it allows building to happen, create these weird incentives. So really keep an eye on that sort of thing. So, and that would say my thing for the future is don't do stupid things.
I think that's very excellent advice to end this really interesting Treasury Guest Lecture Series seminar. So thank you very much to Matt, Philip and Tim for taking the time to share your work and your thoughts with us. And thanks very much to everybody here and also online for joining us today and contributing to the discussion. Please take a look at the website if you want to see which are the upcoming Treasury Guest Lecture seminars on productivity. And those of you who are in the room, we have some refreshments that have been generously provided by our partners Motu Research in this. So thank you very much, Motu. And we really do appreciate the support. The tables are just outside the room by the kitchenette there. So I just finished with the karakia, piki te kaha, piki te ora, piki te wairoa, huie, tai kie. Thank you very much for your time. Mā te wā.